What is neurodiversity?
What is it about these people?
Dyslexia.
Autism spectrum.
ADHD.
Gifted.
Dysgraphia.
All brains are different.
It's okay to be who you are.
This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Hey there, welcome to episode 80. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. Colin Seale is here today, and we'll be chatting about how families can build critical thinking skills in their neurodivergent kids. He's the author of the book Think Like a Lawyer, and we'll also talk about his experiences as an ADHDer who wasn't diagnosed until adulthood. By the way, this is Neurodiversity Celebration Week. So if you would like to hop online on social media and share your support, be sure to do so. I think I've seen people using the hashtag Neurodiversity Celebration Week. And so it would be great for everybody to get involved and show their support. While you're doing that, don't forget to connect with us. You can find our Facebook group, which is the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group, or you can also follow us on Facebook. We're Neurodiversity Podcast, and on Twitter, we are at NeurodiversePod. Up next,
I'm Colin Seale, the founder and CEO of ThinkLaw and the author of Thinking Like a Lawyer, a framework for teaching critical thinking to all students.
Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Dave Morris, the executive producer of this podcast. Putting together something like this is a huge endeavor, from planning and booking guests to putting together the finished product to buying equipment, even traveling to get the stories we present. It's a lot of work. As twice exceptional parents of 3 2E kids, my wife Emily and I wanted to start this podcast so we could share our experiences and help others along the way. So my request is this. If you get some benefit from our podcast, would you consider becoming a Neurodiversity Podcast patron? Just $1 or $2 a month can really add up, and not only would you be helping defray costs, you become eligible for some members-only perks. Listening to our podcast is a free experience, and it always will be. Chipping in will help us continue bringing compelling content to listeners around the world. Go to patreon.com/neurodiversity or go to neurodiversitypodcast.com and click support at the top of the page. And thanks.
Colin Seale is here with us today, author of Think Like a Lawyer. Colin, thanks for being with us. We're really happy to have you back.
I'm excited to be here.
So the last time we spoke, you shared about your book, Think Like a Lawyer, and how using critical thinking skills, is really an opportunity to increase equity in our schools. It's kind of funny. Every time I get on social media, it's amazing. I see a new person who's posting about a presentation that you've done or that they're reading your book, and it's really making a big impact. And I know that you've even expanded on this recently to kind of take the work from Think Like a Lawyer, using it with teachers, so that parents can also do this. So tell me a little bit about this newest endeavor and expansion and why you feel like this is so important.
For people that are not as familiar with our whole sort of construct with Thinking Like a Lawyer, this comes from my experience of being a math teacher who's going to law school at night and is realizing that a lot of the same critical thinking skills that we were begging for our kids to demonstrate in school were exactly what was happening in our law schools, in our business schools. This idea of being able to think on your toes, being able to find the angles, to getting to that level of funk has really been a huge piece of this. And when I step back and I think about what it takes to create a world where critical thinking is no longer a luxury good, it means that we can't pretend that critical thinking is something that it's only controlled by those in the schoolhouse. We've got to ensure that we're able to create constructs for critical thinking at home. And if we're going to talk about equity, if we're going to talk about what it means to create this sort of kind of norms around critical thinking, this sort of balance that I talk about in the book, where as parents, we need to find that line of helping without being too helpful, it means that families have to just be a little bit more resourced when it comes to doing the things they're naturally set out to do. I believe that parents have incredible amounts of critical thinking capacity to nurture it at home. Oftentimes, you don't always see what you do as an asset, though. You don't see that you going grocery shopping, that you budgeting for a house, that you managing laundry, that you kind of just figuring out the logistics of what it takes is a ton of executive functioning, a ton of creativity, a ton of divergent thinking, right? Like when my mother had to figure out how to make $1 out of 15 cents, that's almost the definition of divergent thinking. So when we start kind of giving parents more practical tools around this, it's been really exciting to see the energy build from the ThinkLaw family experience. But even more so, let's talk about the equity angle in families. Let's kind of name it out here. For a lot of you listeners, I'm sure we grew up in households, or you might have someone that grew up in a household where a phrase like, "Don't get smart with me" was common. Getting in trouble for getting smart. I come from a Caribbean family. When you think about Caribbean families, particularly from Barbados, they learn under the British system. Okay, so my mom, when I got to elementary school, she's like, "All right, Colin, 2 3s are 6, 3 3s are 9, 4 3s are 12. And I was like, okay, what are you even talking about right now? Like, I can't just do times tables like this. It doesn't make sense to me, right? So a couple Christmases ago, when we could still travel, I was in New York, and my daughter was doing her thing. And I had some relatives that were like, Colin, your daughter, she asked a lot of questions. And they were almost looking at it as a sign of disrespect of like, why is she asking all these questions? I was like, well, here's the thing. If I'm raising a critical thinker, she can't turn it off. Like, she's not going to be able to be a critical thinker just in this space over here. She's going to have to do it everywhere she's at. So when you tell her, hey, you can't drink anything until you eat your food, she's going to be like, but what if I get thirsty? I don't get, like, why is that a rule? I don't have any problems eating. Like, why do I have to obey this rule? And I'm like, I think I had that same conversation with y'all 20 years ago because that rule didn't make sense. And thinking about some of our families who, you know, I've got family members who are undocumented. And I know that, like, you know, not standing out as too bright of a star, right? Playing it small. These are kind of survival tactics that some of us have had to use intergenerationally that we just have to sort of claim what brilliance looks like at that home front. We are fully capable of being able to nurture and develop the brilliance that exists within our young people. And we're also uniquely qualified to do this. And that's probably the most sort of exciting part about this whole thing. A lot of parents feel like, man, I don't know. I'm just not equipped. Actually, that's not true. You are literally the expert when it comes to this stuff because nobody knows your kid like you do.
What do you think it is that holds parents back from taking some of those risks? You know, you mentioned some of the things like feeling just the way things have always been done. Is that the biggest obstacle?
I mean, let's be clear. Parents, families feeling like they can't be as helpful when it comes to their kids' education, it's not by accident. You go into a school, you're a parent, and you're sitting in an IEP meeting, and you're hearing 89 acronyms you'd never heard before. You're hearing a teacher kind of going at breakneck speed, not taking the time to really break down and explain things to you. Like, okay, well, here's the MAP scores, and according to this, he's in the third quartile or whatever. You're like, sure, yeah. And what's so interesting is one of the most prolific quotes I've ever heard about parent engagement came from Professor Mark Lamont Hill when he said that we can complain all day about families not wanting to come up to school. But have we ever asked a question? For some of our families, have we considered that going to school could be like returning to the scene of a crime? Mm-hmm. If you felt like your education was this dehumanizing experience, this experience that kind of just beat the life out of you, and you just want to do better for your kids, you're like, you know what? Best bet, I'm not going to be involved in this. Best bet, I'm just going to trust the school to do what's necessary. And when I think about like a lot of our families of kids who just don't fit in a box very easily, I think about the frustration my mom must have had with me as a kid who was identified as gifted, but also had ADHD, but was never identified until I was an adult. This feeling of like, I just don't know what to do. Here's this kid, he has all this potential. And every time I go to these schools and every time I talk to these teachers, it's like, it's always, oh, Colin is doing a great job, but, oh, Colin is so brilliant, but Colin has so much ability, but, and it was a real struggle to figure out like, how do you manage within that system? Which is why I'm like, my mom, parents and families all over the world, all over the country, they need to understand that like, it's not a matter of like an option. If there's anything that the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us is that schools were never right to try to work around families, right? Or I'm just going to kind of figure out a way to work despite the level of parental engagement. They need to work to and through our families. That's going to be the biggest lever for being able to break through. And I always tell families, I don't care if you have a 5th grade education, you've got assets, you've got values. There are things that you teach our kids every day. We talk about learning loss, right? But what about the learning gains? What about all the things that your children were able to gather just from being at home or from being in an environment where they had to lean on their families a lot more?
Yeah.
This is kind of like my pep talk. If you're a parent, a family member listening to this, you've got to believe that you are your child's number one champion. And to that extent, I just want you to really be clear about something. Be very clear. How do you define success for your child? What does success mean? And I'll kick it back to you, Emily, for a second, right? Because I know you speak to families all the time as well.
Yeah.
When you hear people talk about success, right? What are the things that families usually say when they're talking heartfelt, or even from your perspective, like you're raising a young child, like you fast forward 20 years, like what do you want to see as you define a success metric for that kid?
My humorous answer when people ask me this is I say, I just want my children to be successful enough to pay for their own therapy. But when I'm talking to families, though, realistically, it is interesting to reflect on how we shift that expectation. I think there's always these big, grand goals like, oh, they're going to go on and they're going to, get this great job and go to this great college and do all of these things. And sometimes it's like, when you really break it down, I just want them to be happy. I want them to be successful and have people in their lives who they care about. And I want them to have some sort of a job that they find, contentment or satisfaction from. That's probably what I hear when I'm talking to families.
So that doesn't differ a lot from what I hear, right? They want their kid to be kind. They want their kid to feel fulfilled. They want their kids to be productive members of society, right? But here's what I always talk to families about, all right? That's how you feel. That's what's deep inside of your heart. And at the same time, if you ask your children what they think you define as success, what are they going to say? Good grades? 100% completion on all your assignments? Getting into a good college? Like, there's this massive gap. And I get it. I get the feeling of pressure that you feel like you got to put your thumb on your kids to be able to do this and do that and do this other thing. But if you're uniquely qualified as an expert in your kid's life, I think you also got to think about unique qualifications to really help your child see the big picture. Make them understand like why they're being pushed, what it is you actually want from them when it's all said and done. Because I've seen this gap play out. And it's usually like shocking how many families would admit that there's a huge gap between what they believe in their hearts for their children and what their kids would actually believe if they had to predict what the priority was. Mm-hmm. So part of these ideas are around what we're doing with the ThinkLaw family experience. It's not even all that complicated, right? It's like, if we're doing something, I'm like, hey, you know what? What would be a better idea? To like meal plan for the week or just buy food like every day and just kind of make stuff every day? Just figure it out like every day. What's the pros and cons of each, right? And we talk about it. And you look at this and I'm like, you know what? I have a lot of feelings about this, okay? Because I'm a clearance guy. Back when I used to go in the grocery stores, right, with COVID, I'd go in less. But I'm like, you know what? What's for dinner? It depends. What is on sale? What's in that special little rack of the stuff that's going to go bad today? And I love living spur of the moment like that. Someone else in my household is not a fan of that. Someone else in my household would rather have a plan for the whole week. But that's not how I roll. That's not what I do, okay? But there's benefits either way. And we can argue, we can go back and forth, you can play devil's advocate. But the process in which our kids are developing those critical thinking dispositions, that level of inquisitiveness, that level of intellectual curiosity, a healthy sense of skepticism, where they're like, like why is the milk always in the back of the grocery store? Like these are all things that get me thinking, like that spark, some conversations going with me. And then, how often are kids getting extended times in their school day to be able to have that level of back and forth.
Talking about neurodivergent kids, dyslexic kids or ADHDers or, autistic kids or 2E kids, how do you feel they fit into this bigger picture of opportunity within critical thinking and equity and that link between family and school?
So a lot of times we talk about equity, and we say equity so often, we can't even really put a name on it. Right? We're like, okay, like it becomes like the latest buzzword, and we don't actually even know what we're talking about. I try to quantify and qualify equity like at the classroom level. Almost every single school system in this country has some sort of mission and vision statement. And a mission and vision statement is saying something or the other about what they're going to do for all students, for all kids and critical thinkers and future whatever and college career, whatever it is. I always look at those and I say all students means no students at all. That's what that means. All students means that somehow we're going to be teaching to some sort of imaginary middle child, and that's what it is. True equity at the classroom level would mean that like each child is getting what they need. We're making a transition from all to each. And if we talk about that transition from all to each, what we're saying is that essentially every child has an IEP, an individualized like education plan that's going to push them to the path towards excellence as defined by, that kid's interest and whatever and assets and all of that. I understand that might seem insurmountable. That might seem impossible. But at least if I position myself around this idea, I know that like it requires me to think through of like, okay, as part of fulfilling excellence for this one kid over here, not having breakfast is probably a pretty big deal. So making sure that food insecurity is addressed is an important piece of this. This person's identity would be a really important part of this as well, because if I'm growing up in a community where I am developing habits that make me feel like I am less than, and this is something that we don't really talk about as often, but I happen to be, when I grew up in Brooklyn, in a self-contained gifted class in elementary school and in middle school. But my school was 100% segregated, right? It's essentially all, Black kids, mix of like people from the Caribbean, African, Black folks that been in the country for generations. And I felt like it was really normal to be Black and brilliant at the same time. It was normal. It was something that just fit in and didn't even stand out to me. It wasn't until I went to a much more diverse high school that I realized kind of what, Dr. Joy Lawson Davis talks about a lot with the whole 3E idea around like, I didn't really understand the way my Blackness played into anything until I got into these different constructs. And I was like, there was something weird. There was something weird about this test at school where the sole criteria for getting in was tests. And the majority of kids on academic probation at this school were Black and brown kids. Didn't make sense to me until I started realizing, well, there's something else going on here. And when I think about this full picture, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to do? What does equity mean? It means that I can't just look at my life as a kid who grew up on free and reduced lunch. I can't look at my life as a kid who grew up as first generation in this country, whose mom was an immigrant, whose dad was incarcerated for selling drugs, and say, hey, I made it. I'm an exception to the rule.
Yeah.
Equity means we've created a system where all kids actually have a fair shot at having exceptional results. Equity means that hashtag Black girl magic can't exist. It can't exist because it shouldn't take magic for a Black girl with phenomenal potential to actually receive phenomenal outcomes in life. When I think about equity, it can't just be that we navigate the system. It has to mean that we're also questioning the system. We're also learning the tools to dismantle the system. We're not just receiving academic success. We're thinking about beyond the classroom. We're thinking about racial justice, economic justice, social justice. And oftentimes I like to use this quote. I even sell t-shirts on it. As I say, like, doing right, it's greater than being right, right? Like, doing right is more important than being right. So if we're really thinking about equity, if we're really thinking about like what it takes to get to where we need to go, we have to have people involved in this puzzle who are seeing a different picture. They're looking at the situation differently. They're thinking about a more creative way to get where they need to go. So I know that today, in the way that schooling is designed today, someone like Albert Einstein would probably be relegated to special education and just pushed aside because he's a friggin' weirdo and nobody wants to deal with him, okay? And what I want to say is, what if we designed education a little bit differently? What if we designed it so that not only would my neurodivergent kids have a real strong chance to shine, but we can also get spaces where a lot more of my kids who are rule followers, who are super compliance driven, who are so good at the art of school, they get exposed to that funk as well. So like, I need to break this down a little bit, because when we talk about equity, culturally responsive education, a lot of times we do this unique thing of doing the most and doing the least at the same time. I'll give you a concrete example. So I live in Phoenix, Arizona. In second grade, as a part of the way that we're helping school systems integrate more culturally responsive frameworks into what they're doing, and to speak to those hearts and those minds of my kids who approach things a little bit differently, we're learning about Antarctica. We got to cover all the continents, right? And the standard says something about like, well, you got to know how food and transportation and shelter kind of impact society. So it's Antarctica. Well, what the world does Antarctica have to do with equity? Well, in this activity, we're going to talk about how you're going to make a plan using a Think Like a Lawyer investigation framework, right? Where you're going to move your school to Antarctica for a year. So like any sort of investigation you would do as a lawyer, you got to identify witnesses. Like, who do you want to talk to get the information that you need? You want to talk about your physical evidence. What are going to be the kind of artifacts, the things you need to bring along with you? What are the things that are going to make this work? And then you want to ask questions. And then the teacher, law and order side, is going to start like dropping out little facts so kids can kind of test their assumptions and kind of refine, and they come up with their plan. All right? They got this really good plan. But Colin, how do people start to think that way? I'm like, well, we start with a think starter. We start with a way to kind of spark that. So it's Phoenix, and we're in July. And you've got a friend who lives in Alaska who's about to come move to Phoenix. What advice are you going to give this friend? Because guess what? My kids have experience. They have education. They have values. They're not empty vessels, right? They've got a lot of knowledge they bring to the table before you even start speaking. But you usually never give them a chance to share it, okay? So you spark their initial thinking. Then you got them in this activity where thinking creatively is the point. Being able to piece this thing together to solve this problem. Now, mind you, I'm saying it's problem-based, not necessarily project-based. I don't always trust project-based. Sometimes project-based is like a recipe, and it's not actually like, project-based learning is just a project that we just happen to be doing. But here's the kicker. When we start thinking about what it takes to not just navigate a system, but to question it and dismantle it and rebuild a new one, now here's part 3. This whole lesson was about overcoming barriers to food, shelter, and transportation. It turns out that right here in Phoenix, Arizona, right there in St. Louis, Missouri, right there in Southside Chicago, we've got families who are struggling with food, shelter, and transportation. Since you and your critical thinking self were able to figure that out in Antarctica, how about you spend some time and you write your city council members, you write your mayor a letter on how they might go about resolving those same exact issues right here in your neighborhood. Because you have the power to do it, don't you? Of course you do.
Yeah.
So you see the spark there? You see why, this is the kind of framework where my straight A, high-flying kid struggles. My neurodivergent kid is on fire, unstoppable. The ideas that come up are the exact ideas that we need.
Your own personal experiences have really given you a lot of insight into this, having grown up as one of those 3E kids. I know the last time that we spoke, you had actually just recently received your diagnosis of ADHD as an adult. I think maybe even a week or a few days prior to our interview, and you were kind of still really grappling with integrating that information about yourself.
You're right. I remember it might have been just a day or two after my diagnosis.
How has being a late diagnosed ADHDer impacted how you view both teaching and parenting?
It's made me rethink almost everything.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that I understood the way that we are that could be an asset.
Mm-hmm.
Intuitively, I can believe that people should lean into their strengths. Realistically, nobody wants to feel like a failure. Nobody wants their kids to struggle in different things either. So it's very, very common to be like, oh, you know what? We got to work on this. We got to work on this. My mom used to have me write out in the encyclopedia. My handwriting was like beyond chicken scratch. It was basically hieroglyphics. I used to have to sit there and write until my hands started hurting so that my penmanship can get better. My penmanship hasn't actually gotten any better. But I think that it feels very risky, Emily, to be like, I'm going to lean into my kids' strengths. Because the weakness is going to be like, we're so used to that negative. We're so used to this system that tells us what we can't do. So I started thinking about it this way. I have to believe, right? From faith and from just my ideas around like the world not being put together in some sort of random way, but being put together in a way that's very intentional, that every person is kind of put here to do this one thing. And if that person doesn't do that one thing, it's a good chance that it won't get done. So if you believe in any way like that as a parent, we've got to think, okay, what is it that your child is passionate about? What is it that your child has unique gifts around? And what can we do to sort of dig into that? I look back and I'm like, you know what? In my law school essay for admission, I said in the last sentence, my closing argument is that I want to go to law school so that I can have a better pathway to address systemic injustices so that stories like mine are no longer an exception to the rule, but all kids will have a chance to be exceptional. And I'm like, really? I didn't even know that was a thing. I only looked it up because I was helping a friend who was applying for law school by giving her a sample essay to look at. And I was like, so this is my motivating factor. This is something that I really cared about. But yet, when I was a computer science graduate at Syracuse and I got admitted early to the master's program in public administration at the Maxwell School, I threw away my life to become a math teacher. And my mom could not understand it. I get it. As a parent, you immigrated to this country and you're like, are you serious? You did all that to be a teacher? But I'm like, if you've got your kid on fire over something, if you got your kid who is losing sleep at night with a level of excitement and energy around something, you got to work with that because that might just be the thing. And I'm telling you, it's hard. I'm living it right now. I've got a 5-year-old. I've got an 8-year-old. And, my daughter, I told her that when she's 8, there's no more freeloading around here. You need a business plan. You need to do something. Not just going to be sitting here eating up all the food, not paying no rent. So her and a couple of her friends, they started this detective agency. But I'm like, y'all don't got no cases. You have no revenue model. But they're putting together these YouTube videos. They're out there doing these things and they're trying to make these cases up. And I'm like, I want her to roll with it. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense in my head, but she's very passionate about it. She spends a lot of time on it. She gets on getting all the spy equipment. Who knows what she'll do with that? Who knows? But there's worse things for kids to be involved in, if we're being real. And if she's rocking with this, I want to support it.
Yeah.
It's hard. I want my son to spend more time, reading. I want him to be more intentional about his homework. But honestly, I want him to do his awesome thing. Do your awesome thing. Do that thing that you won't stop doing. Do the thing that you could do for 3 hours uninterrupted. Do that thing. If that thing is video games and it gets on your nerves, take that to the next level, right? Once this whole thing is over, take your kid to one of those esports conferences and those competitions. Help them understand that there's movie writing, the script writing, there's design, there's marketing. There's so many things that they can do in these fields. And man, if your kid is a neurodivergent child in the way, man, lean into that. One of my really good friends from college, he didn't even finish. He works for Nintendo, redoing classic games. And I'm like, this dude will be the only one. Everyone's playing PlayStation and whatever. And he's like, dude, why are you playing Nintendo? But it was a passion of his. And look at him now. He's leading this whole division where they're revamping these classic games to get this whole kind of retro feel. And they're doing new versions of old games that are 8-bit. And it's interesting to make a game fun and competitive when the technology is really low. It's very creative.
Yeah, having those constraints requires us to become more creative within that. I know we are about out of time, and so as we wrap up, here's my last question for you. If there was somebody who was able to give you some advice when you were young and undiagnosed, what is it that you would wanted to have heard from someone?
The one thing that I wish that my family, my teachers, and eventually even some of my supervisors could have told me that would have made things so much easier for me is, hey, I see that you're struggling. How can I help you? It baffles me sometimes that you can have people who really care about you, who really care about the profession and see magic in you and see you doing in any way, shape, or form something that is like less than that level and not want to be supportive of them, not finding a way. My little brother, who's a software engineer in San Francisco, whose name is also Colin Seale. Don't get it twisted. I'm the original. It's not my fault. My dad had issues and decided to name all of his kids Colin Seale. But I went to go see him in 7th grade when he was in going to school in South Florida. And I remember he was missing all these assignments and all this stuff. But I was like, and the teacher was like, it's so weird because I've seen Colin do it in class. And I'm like, this sounds so familiar. And I go through his bag. And of course, I'm seeing these crumbled up pieces of paper. That's all of his homework. I'm like, all right, Colin, we're going to go to Office Depot. We're going to get you organized, give you some file systems, whatever, because I've had to create systems to make my thing work. And I'm like, that's my brother. Like, I love him. I want him to be successful. I want to set him up for success because he needed support. He's brilliant. He just needed support. And again, if we actually want to even try to look at each, the reality is not every kid in your classroom, not every child in your household even is going to need the same kinds of supports. Some might even need almost little to no support. But for me, if I need support on that extra 20% or that last 10%, like, to just help me out. Help me kind of figure out the way to get there. Don't presume that what I'm doing or not doing is because of laziness, because of a lack of effort, because of a lack of desire. And I think that's the part that really got me. And that part around the whole kind of equity piece is like, it hurts me to the core that it was easier to presume, right? Like, I'm 2 grades accelerated, and I'm sitting in junior level math as a 9th grader, and I'm not submitting a single homework assignment for months at a time. And it's easier to presume that I'm just a lazy black kid who doesn't want to do any work than, why is this kid who's in 9th grade taking junior classes and not doing any work? Is he intimidated because he's 4'11" and everyone here is grown-ups and they've got beards and mustaches and whatever, and he's like is there social emotional piece going on? Is the transition to high school that he needs some support in? Is he just feeling out of his element because he grew up in Brooklyn and now he's at this high school that's much more diverse in the Bronx? And maybe I should pull him aside and have a one-on-one and see what's going on. Maybe I should call his mom and see if there's anything that I could do that she knows, because I bet his mom is an expert in him since she's known him for his whole life. But none of those things happened. So again, I see that you're struggling. How can I help you? Would be awesome. And anyone that's listening to this that has somebody in their life that is going through that struggle, know that they might not always know how you can help them. But if you just at least paid attention to that, if you give them the benefit of a doubt, it can mean wonders for the way that they navigate the world confidently.
Colin Seale, author of Think Like a Lawyer, thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to have this chance to share with you, Emily.
Thinking about the intersectionality of neurodiversity and equity for culturally diverse learners is a layer that's often missing from the conversations surrounding how our schools support learners. One reason I really love talking to Colin is because he's been an advocate for equitable opportunities for learners for a long time. But then he also has this additional layer of somebody who didn't discover he was an ADHDer until he was an adult. Having that unique perspective brings a different and important angle to the conversation. We have to ask, how are we supporting our children to understand themselves and challenge themselves and advocate for themselves? Whether we're supporting them at home as parents or in the classroom as educators, taking the time to explore all the angles where they need support is the key to their ultimate success. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks to Colin Seale for being on the podcast. His website is thinklaw.us. Thanks also to our friends and followers on social media. You can look us up on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And hey, if you know anything about moderating a subreddit, get in touch with me. Is that something we should look into? I don't know. Today's show was produced and edited by me, Dave Morris, and hosted by Emily Kircher-Morris. And for both of us, thanks for listening. Stay safe. Stay healthy. See you next time. This has been a production of Morris Creative Services.